First of all, thank you for your patience and attention during this entire week. I commend you for your attention. Really, we look over at you often. I guarantee the defense table does too. And sometimes when we have 12 people up there, we can tell that some people aren't paying attention. You all seem to be very attentive and willing to listen to everything that's been presented, and I appreciate that. First thing, you may notice somebody missing at our table. ADA Sorted-All is not able to join us. He had a death in the family and had to drive to Illinois at approximately 3 a.m. this morning, so he's not able to join us.
Stefan, can I ask you to bring that microphone just a, if you could turn it just a bit, thank you.
So, where does this leave us? Where do we begin? You may recall at the beginning of this matter, when I gave an opening statement, I talked about pieces of the puzzle. It's been a long time, you may or may not remember that. But I believe that all trials are like a puzzle. I talked about my kids and their enjoyment of puzzles and how oftentimes when we get to the end of the puzzle, there's sometimes a piece or two, or sometimes even 3 pieces missing to that puzzle. But that when you get to the end of the puzzle, you know clearly what the picture is, what that puzzle is meant to depict. And so throughout this week, the state has presented pieces of this puzzle, because it is a puzzle. And I want to talk a little bit about what we've presented and the pieces to this puzzle. Some pieces, as like in any puzzle, are kind of insignificant. We don't really find out a lot. It's kind of the blue piece in the sky when you have a puzzle of the sky. It's kind of that blue piece that really doesn't show much. You just know where it goes. First piece of the puzzle that we heard was Officer Dan Peters. And Officer Peters basically tells us he's the first law enforcement on the scene. He gets to the scene and he testifies about what he saw, about how the difficulty in actually finding the deceased, finding Mr. Leckman, and how he observed Mr. Leckman, Ross Leckman, trying to save his friend. Talks about how at some point in time they're on with 911 and eventually EMT gets there, ambulance gets there, and they move on. And a little bit about how he preserved the scene after. Just a little small piece of the puzzle. Another piece of the puzzle we heard from, again, Deputy Coroner Russ Grimsby. Very small piece of this puzzle. Says I do an initial cursory examination of Peter Kelly. I make an initial quick cause of death determination, and I prepare the body to go to an autopsy. Again, very small, somewhat insignificant piece of the puzzle. We hear from Sheriff Pete Johnson. Again, very small, very quick, very short testimony. But what part of the puzzle does Sheriff Johnson provide us? He was in charge of the press releases. And you'll note that the first press release in this matter, released to all of the press, including the Twin City media, was released at 11 a.m. the following morning, indicating that there had been a homicide, a death, at the St. Croix River on the Interstate Park. And that's released at 11 a.m. Subsequently, approximately 1 o'clock, a second press release is distributed, identifying Peter Kelly. We then hear from some law enforcement people that provide some additional pieces of the puzzle. We hear from Andrew Vitalis, who we tried to show you what the crime scene was like. Remember, Deputy Vitalis is the one who took the crime scene video, basically walked through the crime scene, showed the video of how everything was laid out, took you from Ross Leckman's car right back to the blood, the pool of blood on the ground, over to the parking lot where the stabbing took place. Piece of the puzzle, basically to try to show you the best we can what that crime scene looked like. We heard from Dale Hall, who provided measurements, drew those diagrams that we've seen so often, draw those to scale, and showed some measurements in terms of where various things took place. And we heard from Investigator Rick Gerhardt, another piece of this puzzle. Investigator Gerhardt basically was the lead investigator on this matter, and he testified about all of law enforcement's efforts in terms of determining what happened here. And really, as I mentioned in the opening, was an incredibly bizarre way this crime was actually solved. 2 receipts found over by the picnic tables, which turned out to have nothing to do with this stabbing, but led us to an individual who hadn't been there on that day, who had actually been fishing there 3 days prior, an individual by the name of Tucker Johnson, who again has nothing to do with this, but again, 3 days earlier had just happened to be there, and as luck would have it, fate would have it, happened to be associated with the defendant, Stephen Phillips, Hank Michaels, and Jacob Mossberg. And they contact law enforcement over in Sandy County, over in Chisago County, and they show Tucker Johnson, they describe vehicles, and ultimately, I think, Gunner breaks the case. One of the deputies over there, one of the investigators, knows Tucker Johnson, knows other people he hangs out with, knows one of these guys has a dog named Gunner, and kind of the floodgates open. Really an incredible way that this stabbing and these suspects and ultimately this defendant is found. Because in the state's belief, without that information, without that, for lack of a better term, bit of luck, I don't know whether we would have found what happened to Mr. Kelly. And then I'll talk about some pieces of this puzzle, which I asked you if you'd ever seen CSI Polk County. And none of you raised your hands, none of you had seen it, and none of you have still seen it. Because we put a couple of what we'll call experts up on the stand from the State Crime Lab. And what did they tell us? Not a whole heck of a lot. I'll be the first to tell you. But we put them up there to almost to disprove or to eliminate other aspects of this case. You heard from Nick Stalkey, most of all. Mr. Stalkey indicated there's blood all over the interior of that car. But his ultimate opinion is that blood is not impact blood, but rather cast-off blood. And what's interesting here is I don't think anybody, the defense or the state, is indicating this stabbing took place within this car. Nobody's going to assert that. So while it's not actually known how the blood gets on the roof and on the windows, there's some thoughts in terms of you saw that blade pop open. It would certainly could explain it. And Nick Stalkey indicated, yeah, that's possible. Talked about just shaking the knife might cause blood cast off. We don't really know. But his ultimate expert opinion is that it came from cast off and not from an impact injury while inside the car. And I think, interestingly enough, nobody's claiming that this stabbing took place inside this car. So it's a piece of the puzzle, but it doesn't really tell us much. We heard from, I believe, Molly Ross, piece of the puzzle, who indicated that blood was sent to her to examine for the presence of any marijuana or other drugs of the defendant. And it comes back negative. So again, that doesn't tell us much. And why doesn't it tell us much? Because she says the blood is taken approximately, I believe, 6 days after the stabbing. So it was taken and sent down, but she said that doesn't surprise me that it would be 0. She wouldn't expect that the THC, which is marijuana, would show up in the blood 6 days later. So again, a piece of the puzzle, but it really doesn't tell us much. You might have heard quick reports about a footprint that doesn't belong to Mr. Kelly. A fingerprint that's not identifiable. So ultimately, our grand Polk County CSI TV show presents a bunch of expert testimony that I don't think really tells us much at all. And where does that leave us? That leaves us with the 4 big pieces of this puzzle. And those 4 big pieces of this puzzle are the 4 witnesses that were there that night. First witness we saw, or we heard from that night, was Ross Leckman. Ross Leckman testifies that on that day, on that fateful day, he and his buddy Pete decided to go fishing, like they do so often, sometimes as much as 4 times a week. They decide after work, pack up their fishing gear and fish on the Minnesota side of Interstate Park. Why do they go over there? Peaceful, less people. They've got a spot. They don't want to fish up there. They don't want to deal with people that are on the other side. I think a lot of people have testified. Very popular spot on the Wisconsin side. More people populate that side to fish. So they go over, sit down. Ross Leckman doesn't deny for a second that sits down, pops a red apple ale, indicates he has 4 and Peter Kelly has 4 throughout the night. And these questions, could it have been 5, could it have been 6? No, brought 8 cans. We each had 4. And subsequently you've heard Peter Kelly's blood alcohol content was 0.043, approximately half the legal limit in Wisconsin, which would jive, if you will, with what Mr. Leckman has told us. So, they begin fishing. And they noticed some people across the river. They noticed groups of people. I think he said there was 4 in one and a couple in another and some more down the river. So I think at some point in time he thought there was up to perhaps as many as 9 people over on the other side. You heard the defendant testify later that at some point in time his group, including the other friends that left earlier, including, I think he said there was some Hmong group, he said there could have been as many as 13 people on the Wisconsin side. So Ross Leckman and his friend Pete are sitting there fishing, and he says, we're hearing some profanity, some things across the river. And at first they ignore it, just kind of let it be. It's getting to be darker, it's getting to be a little more loud, it's getting to be a little more obnoxious. And they start to smell marijuana coming across the river. And it's interesting again that there's questions about, well, could you really have smelled this? Where were you? Was it blowing? Was the wind blowing? All these other things. Because you're going to be asked to weigh credibility here. You're going to be asked to decide who's telling the truth, who's leaving things out, and who may be lying. Ross Leckman said they smelled marijuana. Comes out that all those guys across the river acknowledged they were smoking marijuana. So as the sun's going down, it's getting darker, they smell some marijuana, and it's getting to be time, and they make a comment across the river. Why don't you guys hold it down, put out the dope, something along those lines, stop swearing, show a little respect, something along those lines. He doesn't remember the exact words. He doesn't. Ross Leckman tells us that the response to that is, why don't you homo shut up? Might have been exchanged. I don't know. He doesn't remember exactly the words. As they're packing up to leave, it's dark. They're packing up to leave, putting their lights on, putting their lights off, or moving their lights around. He says there's another comment from the Wisconsin side about, are you homos leaving? And there's a response back from them. Again, he's not denying it. Something to the fact of, you know, why don't you guys just take off? Why don't you get out of here? Why don't you leave? Response back, why don't you come and make us? And Ross Leckman doesn't deny that, I believe it's Pete Kelly, that says, we'll be over in 5 minutes. Doesn't deny that. Does he say now that it was a mistake? Yep, I think he acknowledges that. And what do they hear from the response? See you then, or I'll be here. One or the other. And what do we know about that? We'll talk about that later on when we talk about Stephen Phillips. But Stephen Phillips, the individual who's sitting right next to his friend, one of his best friends, says his best buddy, the defendant, says, I'll see you then. When the response is, I'll be over in 5 minutes. I'll see you then. Very similar to what Ross Leckman testified to. So he says they pack up and they walk back to the car. Still not thinking anything about this, but get in the car. During the car, they have a discussion. And he acknowledges it. They have a discussion that they should go over and say something to these guys about what's being done. Does he acknowledge that's a bad decision? Yep, he does. And he drives over with his friend Pete, and you hear it, you've heard testimony about this drive down to the interstate park. And tree-lined, large trees, brick-lined walls along the roadway to prevent you from going over a cliff. And then they park some distance away from this group. Ross Leckman tells you it's to prevent his car from being vandalized, or Pete Kelly's car from being vandalized. It's his idea. He acknowledges that. It's my idea to park here. Don't want, if we come down here again, to have our car vandalized. So they park down there. He absolutely denies that they did anything to hide, to turn their lights off. He took a look at that. Some of the pictures, I think, in the exhibits. You couldn't possibly, he says, drive down that roadway with your lights off. Just couldn't. And you heard testimony on how the group is picking up, the defendant's group is picking up their fishing gear, walking down the 10-foot hill, the 10-foot drop-off. The defendant acknowledges he and his friend Stephen are making at least 2 trips back and forth, making 2 trips back and forth. They're walking down this embankment. They couldn't even see if lights were approaching at that point in time. So they park, and they walk over, and they stop at that tree, that split tree that we've heard about that's marked on the diagrams, and they sit there and they look. And I asked Ross Leckman, well, why'd you do this? And he says they had seen 9 people over there at one point in time. The defendant says there could have been as many as 13 over there at one point in time. And if they're going over there to say something, I think Mr. Leckman indicated, wanted to make sure they were going to be okay. They see what he believes to be 3 guys at that point. In fact, all the time, Mr. Leckman thinks there's 3 guys. Doesn't even know about the 4th guy. So, as they approach, they hear, see, those pussies didn't even show up. In a very loud manner. And they say, we're right here. I think Jake Mossberg's statement in his interview was, he said, we're right here, son. And the defendant's group sees them. And Mr. Leckman will tell you that the defendant approaches him and says something profane, profanity, foul-laced. Doesn't know what it was, but he gets up in his face, and Ross Leckman acknowledges that he pushes him down. That the defendant goes down and he goes down with him. He acknowledges that. And he also acknowledges he's embarrassed by that. He's embarrassed by his behavior. But he acknowledges it. That they both get up, and his buddy Pete says, "Hey Roscoe, he's got a knife." He acknowledges he doesn't even see it other than a glint of the steel at that point in time. Doesn't exaggerate. Doesn't indicate that he's, making stabbing motions. Doesn't indicate anything. Doesn't even indicate that he sees it other than his glint and other than his friend Pete saying, "Roscoe, he's got a knife." And he says this whole time there starts to be verbal exchanges going back and forth. Back and forth. And he says most of the time it's Pete Kelly, some of the times it's him. He doesn't know exactly what's being said. There's a lot of swear words being thrown around. Ross Leckman acknowledges that there was swearing going on both parts, on both sides. Doesn't try to minimize it. Doesn't try to exaggerate it. I don't think he tries to claim that they were angels in this situation. We want to address the fact that this is a place to Ross Leckman that's, I don't think I even overstepped, that's got like a sacred part of his life. I mean, I can't make it up. The guy was an Eagle Scout and did his Eagle Scout project in that same park. Been going to that park since he was a kid, takes his family. Mr. Kelly has 5 kids under the age of 10. Take their family there, they fish, they go there constantly. And the last thing that they want are groups of people swearing, smoking pot, and causing trouble. And so they talk about giving some respect, about correcting some behavior. And he's keeping his eye on what's going on over here. Takes his eye off. His friend Pete is up with the defendant. And at some point in time, he acknowledges, again, Hank Michaels. Doesn't try to minimize it. Doesn't try to say Hank Michaels comes up and starts swearing and raising heck and getting physical. Doesn't try to say that. Says Hank Michaels tries to get between the defendant and Pete Kelly. And I think the question was Hank Michaels rebuffed? And he says, yeah. And he says, by who? Both of them. Because Pete Kelly and the defendant at this point are going jab for jab in terms of verbal altercations. One would say something, I think the other one would say something back. One would say something, and the other one would say something back. And does Pete Kelly know that this defendant's got a knife? Yeah, he does. But this is where this reasonableness comes in. Does anybody really believe that based on somebody being pushed down, that somebody's going to get stabbed at that point? I don't think Pete Kelly thinks in his wildest dreams anybody's going to use a knife. And so Ross Leckman sees this confrontation, sees Mr. Michaels try to intervene, doesn't work. He goes back around in front of the car, and then at some point in time, he's distracted. He thinks maybe it was taillights, which there were 2 vehicles, recall. Thinks maybe it's taillights, and he looks away. Says he looks away for approximately 3 to 4 seconds. On my account, that was 4 seconds. And in that 4 seconds, he turns around And the defendant and Pete Kelly had separated, and his friend is running away saying, "Roscoe, we gotta go." He stabbed him. And I'm picturing what he's thinking at this point. He doesn't know what's going on. He's saying, "Pete, what happened?" He goes back over to the cars. These guys are now in their vehicles. He says he looks at the defendant and says, "Did you stab my friend?" And the response from the defendant is, "Yeah, I stabbed him." And that's when he gets in the car, shuts the door, car starts to back up. I think he even said kind of back up towards him, and kicks the back of the car. Doesn't deny that. Doesn't deny that at all. And he kicked the car. And what's important here in terms of credibility, I'm sure there's going to be something brought up, because it was brought up over and over again, and when Mr. Leckman was crossed, is you were interviewed the night that this happened. And he doesn't say anything about this altercation that he has with the defendant. And he also doesn't say anything about kicking the car. Doesn't mention that. And the normal question would be, why? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to think about what Ross Leckman goes through from this point forward. The vehicles have just squealed out of there. He's been told his friend's been stabbed. His friend has told him he's been stabbed. And now he's left in the pitch dark. Because we've heard incessantly about how dark it is. Correct? We've all heard how dark it is. We've tried to describe the darkness, for crying out loud. And by all accounts, the only thing lighting that park up at that point were dome lights, perhaps hood lights, like trunk lights, we've heard perhaps, and then perhaps little flashlights and little lanterns that the defendant and his group were carrying around. That's all gone now. It is pitch dark. And Ross Leckman is running, looking for his friend. And it's so dark, he runs past him. And he hears him. He hears him breathing. He hears the breath going out of him. And he goes back and he tries to help him. And he realizes at that point, not only does he not have a cell phone, but everything that they've got, including cell phones, is locked in Mr. Kelly's car. And so he does the normal thing to do. He starts looking for keys. Searching Pete's pockets, searching anywhere that the keys could be. And as we saw in those pictures and on that video from the crime scene, that blood trail is going back and forth as I'm picturing Peter Kelly losing blood, life draining out of him as he runs down that path. And for some reason, the keys end up on one. He probably reached in his pockets. This is all guesswork at this point. But the keys are on the other side of the path. And he's laying on the road, and he's laying on the other side. It's a one-lane road going in there. And so Ross Leckman, panicking, can't find anything, runs back to the car, feels the wheels again where sometimes people hide keys, looks perhaps in the gas tank where people sometimes leave keys. Can't find them, can't get in the door. He says I'm picturing the sheer and utter terror as he's trying to break a window with his knees. Tried a couple of times to break a window out with his body. Couldn't do it. He's feeling around on the floor, feeling around on the ground outside that car, trying to find a rock to break a window. Can't find it. Can't find a rock anywhere. And so I'm assuming in pure adrenaline, he picks up a sign or breaks off a handicap sign and smashes out the back window of the car. And you've seen the pictures of the car. You've seen those pictures of the back window of that car, and you'll get all these exhibits back in deliberations. I ask you to take a look at Mr. Kelly's car and the back window and how that's smashed out. But I'm just picturing the sheer terror at this point. And he gets into that car and he finds his cell phone. And he puts on a flashlight and he runs back to his friend Pete. Tries to dial 911. Pete's trying to talk to him, but there's blood coming out of his mouth. Can't understand what he's saying. He's talking to 911. He's trying to give them directions down to where they are. And he tells them they're parked by Burgers Lake. Well, read the transcript. You'll have the transcript of the 911 call. You can read that. You can read how utterly terrified and the trauma he's going through as he's trying to explain to this 911 operator where they are. We're down by Burgers Lake. What lake? I don't know where that is. I'm down at Interstate Park. I'm over by, I think he said Burgers Lake a couple of times. It's also known as Lake of the Dells. This 911 operator doesn't understand where that is. And then she starts giving him instructions on how to try to save his buddy's life. And he tries. He realizes the spot he's been holding with all the blood isn't actually even on the side where the wound is. Because all the blood had drained from underneath him. He lifts up his shirt, he sees that wound. He tries to cover it. He tries to give him his friend Pete mouth to mouth. He's vomiting on him. And I just can't imagine what that would be like. Finally, after, again, what he says seems like a long time, but he acknowledges probably wasn't that long. Officer Peters arrives. And eventually the ambulance comes. And what does Mr. Lechman have to do next? He has to hang around the scene. Put in the back of the sheriff's deputy's truck. Then he gets transported back to the sheriff's department. He's covered in his best friend's blood and vomit. He's just given this best friend of his mouth to mouth. He's put his hand over a bleeding, fatal wound and watched his friend try to tell him what's going on as blood's coming out of his mouth. And then law enforcement interviews him. I think about 1 a.m. is what he testified to. They interview him. And you heard from Investigator Gerhardt, we don't usually, in an officer-involved shooting, they don't even interview the officer for 24 to 48 hours because of the trauma involved in that. Because you can't know if you're going to get a reliable history. But Ross Lechman interviews because at this point we're trying to find out who killed Peter Kelly, if there's a murder on the loose, public safety's involved, and so they interview him. And Ross Lechman does his best, as he indicates, he does his best to describe the suspects, does his best to describe the vehicles, does the best he can. But to now somehow go back and say, wait a second, in that first interview, he didn't say anything about this initial physical confrontation with the defendant. Are you making that up? Because that's the presumption. Keep in mind, and that's acknowledged, he doesn't say anything about that. But you saw the video of him at the crime scene, I believe a couple of days later, and he talks about it. He talks about the confrontation, talks about kicking the car, all of those things in that second interview. The interesting thing is, He doesn't talk about kicking the car on the night of that first interview. Does anybody dispute that happened? Anybody that was there? Nobody disputes that. And I don't know if we're really disputing that the confrontation initially was between Mr. Leckman or the defendant or not. Because let's analyze what we know from the rest of those witnesses. Jake Mossberg says, I don't really know, but I believe the confrontation was between the defendant and Mr. Kelly. Not sure, but that's what I believe. Hank Michaels says, I didn't see it. I get out of the car, first thing I see is defendant holding knife. Ross Leckman says, no doubt it was me. Not proud of it, embarrassed by it, in fact, that it was me. Stephen Phillips. Again, best friends, known the defendant all his life, standing right next to where this happened. 4 to 5 feet away, says, yep, it was Mr. Leckman and the defendant. And the defendant who took the stand says, I don't know who it was. So I don't know if we're really arguing over this or not, but you weigh the evidence, you weigh it, and I think it's clear that this initial confrontation, as Mr. Leckman indicated, is between he and the defendant. Again, you're going to have to weigh the credibility. Ross Leckman doesn't minimize, doesn't exaggerate, doesn't paint he and his friend Pete as perfect angels. In fact, he says, I'm the one that pushed the defendant down first. I'm the one that when the defendant pulls a knife, I'm the one that says, you're a pussy. Are you really going to pull a knife on me? You're a pussy or something to those effects. He acknowledges he's the first one to say that. Again, it can't be an easy thing to do, just get up there and acknowledge some of your embarrassing conduct as an adult. These individuals are adults. And he's embarrassed by it. So ultimately, you're in charge of making the determination in terms of credibility. But what he does say clearly is that when he's standing in the back of the car and he sees the defendant and Pete Kelly standing outside the car, that he looks away for approximately 3 to 4 seconds. And the next thing he knows is his friend running away, saying, Roscoe, we got to go. He stabbed me. Nobody ever shakes his testimony in regard to that. It's interesting that in terms of other things that I think bolster his credibility, he says, when we first got fishing that day, I sneezed. And somebody across the river says, bless you. Raise my hand to acknowledge that. Nobody else says anything about that until we hear from the defendant. The defendant says, yep, somebody sneezed. I said, bless you. The guy acknowledges it. It's just interesting the number of times you hear Ross Leckman's version being repeated. He doesn't deny, they say, that he and Mr. Kelly says, I'll be over in 5 minutes. But he also says, response is, see you then. Confirmed by Stephen Phillips. Confirmed repeatedly by Stephen Phillips. Another big piece of the puzzle is we start to hear from the 3 other witnesses. We hear from Jacob Mossberg. Jacob Mossberg, a very good friend of the defendant by everybody's own acknowledgement. He again explains the day. he explains this initial verbal confrontation as follows. He says, you think that's funny, coming from the Minnesota side, you guys think that's funny? And then he throws in that there's a homos or faggots to follow that. And what I find interesting about that is all four of the defendant's group, he and his three friends, when I asked them about the use of the term homos, faggots, gays, you four guys use that on a daily basis? And I believe all four of them said, yeah. So now the version is that from across the river on the Minnesota side, somebody yells, you think that's funny? Homos or something along those lines. And what I find, again, interesting about that is Ross Leckman's testimony that this was all about respect. This was all about behavior while at these parks. This was all about marijuana smoking and then confronting them over that. So if you believe that at least this initial verbal altercation was about that, do you really think that one of these gentlemen from the Minnesota side is going to scream a derogatory, homophobic slur across the river? Doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Seems to contradict what the purpose or what the origination of this silly verbal argument started as. He acknowledges that he's smoking marijuana. He also acknowledges that he's about 25 yards away from the defendant the whole time he's on the scene. He indicates again that Stephen Phillips is going to be the closest one to the defendant. He'd have the best viewpoint. He indicates that in terms of when the physical altercation takes place between Pete Kelly and the defendant, that 1 foot is in and 1 foot is out of the car. And there's a couple of things, and I'm not going to sit here and rehash everybody's testimony with you, because we'll be here for another 5 days. So I picked out a couple of prime things from everybody's testimony. He indicates he doesn't hear exactly what's being said across the river. He does acknowledge that he also hears the defendant say, yelling back across the river, "That's right, pussies." He indicates that the defendant, his exact words, the defendant says what's on his mind, and Levi doesn't take shit. That's his statement regarding his best friend, or one of his best friends, who he's coming to testify to at his friend's trial. He acknowledges that he's been in fights himself, that he would have jumped in, that he would have joined this fight. He's acknowledged he's a construction worker, he can take care of himself. He's raised in that environment, uses the F word like it's normal everyday statements, like it's just a regular old word. He doesn't deny that. I asked him, what happens in the fights that you've been a witness to or a part of? It says one guy wins, one guy loses, guy might get beat up a little bit, and then they go their own way. I said, did you think that was going to happen here? I think he agreed with that. I asked him, you had a shotgun in your truck. Yes, I did. You had ammunition in your truck. You know what his response was? Plenty. That's his response. He had knives in his truck. He had a long BB gun with a scope on it, pellet gun, with ammunition. Acknowledged all these things. Did you ever, I asked him, think about going back and getting any of that stuff to protect your friend? No. He didn't. showed him the knife. He worked at Gander Mountain, took a look at the knife, identified that knife, said, is that tip used for anything? He says, yes, it was. That type of knife is used for puncturing things. Jake Mossberg was asked to demonstrate the shoulder lock that he saw the defendant and Peter Kelly in when they got out of the vehicle. And Mr. Nelson stepped up and did that demonstration with him. And you recall it. Hands out here. I'm going to have Investigator Gerhardt step forward for me. The demonstration was shoulders, hands on shoulders, hands on shoulders. Can't take that back. That was the demonstration of what happened. That Jake Mossberg said happened between the defendant and Peter Kelly. First of all, I want you to use your common sense in terms of shoulders on shoulders, how anybody would yank anybody out of a car. Did he grab his shirt and pull him? I don't know. Is there pushing and stuff going backwards and forwards? Are you being aggressive? Jake Mossberg says, yeah, they're being aggressive. Now imagine this. They're going shoulder to shoulder with each other, like this, according to Jake Mossberg. And this whole time, what does the defendant have out? A knife. Which, he's got a knife sitting here like this in his hand. He's popped the blade on that. And it's sitting here, hands on shoulders. And by Jake Mossberg's account, that confrontation is fast and happens in a matter of seconds. He explains, they're looking eye to eye. Jake Mossberg's words, they're looking eye to eye. Not this business about I'm down here, I'm bent over, I'm somehow got my head cupped with his hand. Hands on shoulders, looking eye to eye. And the next thing he knows, Pete Kelly backs up and starts to run. Eye to eye. There's been a lot of talk about what happened afterwards. Because this consciousness of guilt, or the defendant's behavior afterwards, is important. Because you can use that to look into intent and other elements. And what does Jake Mossberg do? They all go back to Stephen Phillips' house. There's differing statements about that they have a meeting, but everybody seems to acknowledge, except for the defendant, that there's an agreement that they're going to keep quiet, not say anything. They're not going to the cops. There's even a discussion to ditch the knife, according to some of them. What are you going to do with the knife? We're going to ditch the knife. We're going to keep the knife. And Jake Mossberg sends out a text to a friend, says, you don't know me, you don't know Hank, you don't know Stephen, you don't know Levi, and we're not going fishing this weekend. And he's able to explain that, or at least his version of why that's sent is, we're scared that somehow our friends are going to show up at the St. Croix River and somehow somebody's going to take retribution on them. I think that's far-fetched to begin with, but it's really far-fetched when he follows that text up with, delete this. He's so concerned. Why does he tell him to delete the text? They're hiding, in the state's opinion. They're hiding out. They're not going to go to the police. They've decided that. And now they're sending out texts to cover themselves. it's interesting because all four of these gentlemen talk about how scared they were. And when they're driving out of there, they're so scared. What do we learn? And I learned something through this. I'm watching Investigator Vitalis's video of the crime scene. And I watched it 20 times throughout this. And every time we get to that little fish, I go, forward, forward, forward. Why are you filming this little fish on the side of the road? I never figured out I mean, he even says there's water on the fish. I never even think about if there's any relevance to this. Never dawned on me until during the testimony of these four guys, somebody, and I'm blanking, says Mossberg pulled over and dumped a fish out of his truck. An illegal fish. And then a little bit later, Mossberg's not involved with this because it's not his truck, but they dumped the marijuana. A little bit later, they dumped the pipe in another bag. They're so scared. It's such a traumatic event, but I'm going to dump my DNR violation fish and get rid of my marijuana into the woods. Their thought processes were to cover this up, cover up what they were doing, get the heck out of there. Driving down Highway 8, they see that officer in the gas station. They don't stop. They get on 95, they see that trooper with lights and siren. They don't stop. They never call 911. Not before this happens, not while it's happening, not after it's happening, not when they're driving home, not when they get home, not the next day. And why is that important? We harped on that a lot. Why is that important? Because again, consciousness of guilt. You can consider that when you make your determination in terms of this defendant about his intent. You can use that information, and I ask that you do. Another big piece of the puzzle. Hank Michaels. Hank Michaels testifies again, talks about his relationship with the defendant. Very good friends for a long time, maybe best friends now. And Hank Michaels indicates again that he's a little bit further up the stream. He confirms what most people are saying, that Stephen and the defendant, Stephen Phillips and the defendant, are sitting at this picnic table together. They're up river. Don't hear most of what's going on across the river, but he does say that he hears one thing specifically. He says he hears from across the river somebody saying, "I'm going to put you to sleep. I'm going to come over there and put you to sleep." And there's disputes about whether that's even said or not. But where I think that's important is we heard from the defendant yesterday. And he indicates that when he hears this first, he claims there's something coming across the river. When he hears him first say something, he's not worried. Doesn't even think they're talking to him. He can't believe that they're talking to him. He doesn't know what he's done. But he says, when I hear this comment about "I'm coming over to put you to sleep," I'm scared. That's when I get nervous. I get scared about whether they're serious or not. And again, I want you to weigh credibility here. If he's so scared, if he's so nervous, he comes right back. If this statement was made that "I'm going to come over there and put you to sleep," this defendant comes back with, "I ain't even tired yet." Hank Michaels says it. I think all three of the witnesses say Levi makes this comment back across. And then Hank Michaels doesn't really remember anything else that's said. during this initial confrontation. He said the yelling match takes place for about 5 to 10 minutes, but that's what he recalls hearing. And at some point in time, they're packing up. They're getting ready to leave. And I said, did the defendant say anything at this point? And he says, yes. He says, the defendant turns and screams. Not talks, not yells. Screams across the river, "Oh, you pussies didn't even show up." And the defendant screams that. And I asked him, in your opinion, did that seem to indicate that he was waiting for them to come? He says, yeah. It seemed to indicate that he was very afraid of what was going to happen? He says, no. Because that's the state's belief. Nobody disagrees with the fact that at least at some point in time, somebody from the Minnesota side, I think it's Pete Kelly, says, we'll be over there in 5 minutes. And then the defendant says something along the lines of, I'll be here or see you then. He's not scared. He's not even a little nervous. He doesn't pack up. He doesn't leave. Doesn't do any of that stuff. Why? What's he got in his pocket? His knife. And as he says in his own words, in the defendant's own words, I'm a tough guy with my knife. Hank Michaels says, again, what he observes, and he talks about the screaming statement that the defendant makes across the river. Pussies didn't even show up. And at that point in time, Mr. Kelly and Mr. Leckman appear. He talks about, at that point in time, he's getting back into his car. And he says, I don't even see this initial physical confrontation. I get out of my car, and the first thing I see is the defendant's got a knife out. But he says in his statement, and he said on direct, that Levi did tell him about this confrontation. And that's what I was getting to. I've asked a lot of questions about all these conversations these guys had, because they all know what's happened. Or they all claim to know what's happened. Hank Michaels knows about this initial confrontation, at least he says he does, because he's been told by the defendant. They're on their drive home, this 45 minutes. They're talking about this. I don't think it's even reasonable to believe that they're not talking about just what just went down. There's a telephone conversation, too, with the defendant's father. And it's on a speakerphone. It comes through the Bluetooth. And he tells his father what's happened. It's a phone call with Jake Mossberg, and Mossberg's in a different car. He says, didn't know what happened. So there's a conversation with Jake Mossberg. And he tells him what happened. They get back to Stephen Phillips' house, and they have another conversation. It would be the state's position that, again, they're told what happened. They get on Xbox later that evening. Friend that wasn't there, Jacob Jaffe's on this chat room. It would be the state's position that he gets to hear what happened. The defendant gets to say his story over and over and over again. That's my belief. I think the evidence reasonably show that. What's interesting about Hank Michaels and his statement about that initial physical confrontation was he says, quote, Stevie was right there. Stevie saw the whole thing happen. Stephen Phillips was there. He did see what happened, and he testified as to it was Mr. Leckman that had this initial confrontation with the defendant, as Ross Leckman stated. Hank Michaels, again, very good friends with the defendant, says basically the defendant and Pete Kelly are going back and forth. Pete Kelly would say something, and the defendant would agree with him in a sarcastic tone, smart-out tone. Pete Kelly would say something, perhaps say, you're such a pussy, And the defendant would sit there with the knife and say, yep, I'm a pussy. And that's kind of how it went back and forth. And I say at this point in time, the defendant has the knife out, and I ask Mr. Michaels, are you afraid? He says, well, a little bit. But he's not afraid, too afraid, to come around the front of the car and stand in between them. Try to break this up. And say, guys, we don't need to do this. So he's obviously not afraid for himself, not afraid he's going to get killed or be an imminent great fear of great bodily harm. He gets between them, tries to break it up. And he says, Pete Kelly says, get out of here, you lanky bastard, or something like that. Some people hear that, some people don't. He gives up, walks back around the car. He does indicate that repeatedly Pete Kelly tells them, just leave. You're not worth our time. Get out of here. Guys, you just need to leave. It's interesting that when Hank Michaels talks about this confrontation between, physical confrontation between Pete Kelly and the defendant, he is told by the defendant that he's being punched during this confrontation. When he's told that, I don't know, because I think there are a lot of conversations. But he's told by the defendant that he's being punched. And I asked him, did you see any punches? No. Does Stephen Phillips see any punches? No. Does Jake Mossberg see any punches? No. Does Ross Leckman see any punches? No. I don't even think the defendant, when he took the stand, acknowledged that there were any punches thrown. He also indicates that he's driving, that they're driving down Highway 8. He says he doesn't see the trooper at the bottom of the road, but he believes somebody made a comment about it. But clearly, as they're driving on 95, he sees the trooper with lights and sirens. I said, did you see that? Yeah, how could I miss that? But they don't stop, they don't call 911. It says on the ride home, what'd you do? I'm trying to figure out what was done during this 45-minute ride home. Well, he says the defendant put on some music. And they sat quiet. Talked about when did you find out, when did Hank Michaels find out about Peter Kelly's death? Following day, in the afternoon, he's at Menard's, working. At Menard's working. And he finds out Peter Kelly has died. And Hank Michaels, who, although was the driver, wasn't involved in this stabbing, what's his response? He walks out of work. He's so shocked that he walks out of work. What does he do? Calls the defendant. He's got a plan at that point that they're going to turn themselves in. Hank Michaels does. He calls the defendant and he says, I'm going to turn himself in. And his response to what did Levi say, what did the defendant say? He said, I'm going to go back to work for the rest of the day. And then it didn't appear to be a priority to him to turn himself in. He talks about the night previously when they get back from Stephen Phillips' house. They all got on Xbox. He says they played Call of Duty. We explained what Call of Duty is. He said Levi was playing Call of Duty. The night of the stabbing, they get in a chat room. Stephen Phillips, Hank Michaels, there's a Jacob Jaffe, who wasn't involved, and the defendant. And and they play Xbox. A couple other things about Hank Michaels. He says, he acknowledges. I asked him if the defendant got in a fight, would you have backed him up? Would you have jumped in? He says, yeah, I would have. The statement is Levi is built, lifts weights, he's seen him in fights before, and that Levi is not one to back down from anything. The last thing he says during one of my chances to question him is he had made a comment about pulling the knife. He made a statement hearing one of the police officers that he thought that was an attempt to de-escalate things, to pull a knife. I asked him, Mr. Michaels, didn't pulling that knife, popping that blade, didn't that escalate everything? And he agreed with me. I asked Hank Michaels because he indicated there were a lot of bad decisions that night. And I asked him, I think one of the last questions was, wasn't the worst decision of all when that knife was pulled? And he said yes. And then we have our last big piece of the puzzle, at least in terms of the individuals that was there. And we have the interview of Stephen Phillips, who probably knows the defendant longer than anybody. I think he says from the time he was born, he knew him because he lived right across the street from him. And again, it's uncontradicted that through most of that day, it's he and the defendant sitting next to each other. He talks about, again, this D's Nuts video, that they're yelling it to each other, that they're smoking marijuana, they're louder than normal. They're being loud, they're being obnoxious. And that at some point in time, he says a statement across the river is, you think that's funny. And then at some point in time, he doesn't hear anything about, I'll put you to sleep. He says at some point in time, he hears from across the river that they'll be over in 10 minutes. Is his word, I'll be over there in 10 minutes. And what's so important about Stephen Phillips' testimony, and he says it in his first interview, and he says it in his second interview, and he says it when he takes the stand, that when the response to, I'll be over there in 10 minutes, that this defendant says, I'll see you then. I'll see you then when you get here. State's opinion, that's an invitation, folks. They're getting ready to pack up, and again, Stephen Phillips is next to the defendant, and he says, those pussies didn't even show up, and the defendant agrees and yells, those pussies didn't even show up. And Stephen Phillips says, hey, Levi, you got the last word. Attaboy. And that's directed across the river. Mr. Leckman and Mr. Kelly appear. He sees the initial confrontation with Mr. Leckman. He says he's tossed to the ground, I think is the word. The defendant is tossed to the ground, which is similar to what Mr. Leckman says in terms of he pushed him to the ground. The difference is that Stephen Phillips, while standing right next to that confrontation, 4 to 5 feet away, I believe I was standing approximately here, 4 to 5 feet away, Stephen Phillips indicated that when the defendant gets up, takes out his knife, pops it open and says, don't fuck with me, I've got a knife. Stephen Phillips, lifelong best friend of the defendant, makes that statement, and he never backs down from that, not one time. He says after that happens, they are told by the gentlemen that have come across, fine, just go home. You guys can just leave then. Says at some point in time, he sees the Hank Michaels interaction, similar statements. It says at some point in time, the defendant has come back across the car and he's halfway in the car. His butt was probably just touching the seat. And then after that, he doesn't really see what happens, he says. All he knows is after that, the two of them broke apart. And the defendant turns around and says, "We need to fucking go." They get in the car, they drive home. He talks about dumping marijuana. He acknowledges, "I'm the one that threw the marijuana out the window, I dumped the pipe." In terms of looking at Stephen Phillips' credibility, notice this too. On the drive home, he talks about the telephone calls from the defendant's father. Says, yeah, they're on speakerphone. That's the first time I'd heard that. From Stephen Phillips, yeah, they're on speakerphone. That's how I can hear. Turns out, yep, Bluetooth headed over the speaker. And Stephen Phillips says, defendant's father says, "Did they see your license plates?" And nobody else says that. And then we'll talk a little bit more about when Mr. Kendall testifies. He acknowledges, yeah, I said that. Keep that in mind. It says at some point Levi turned on some music, talks about the two squad cars they passed, and all of those things. He talks about when they get back to his house, they talk outside. They talk about their decision again to keep quiet. And also, in terms of that, he talks about later on that night, they get on Xbox. He doesn't think at first that Levi joins that chat room, but when he's shown his statement to the police, he acknowledges, yes, he was in there. Now, what Stephen Phillips says in regard to the defendant's actions is as follows. He says he'd agreed that he was being a smartass all night. He says after the knife is pulled, Mr. Kelly and Mr. Leckman say, "Just leave. Get out of here." He doesn't hear all of the things that Levi might have said. He never hears the conversation about, "I'll put you to sleep." And that when the shoulder lock or whatever takes place, that Levi Acre-Kendall is not in that car. His butt is just about to touch the seat, is his statement. A couple other pieces to this puzzle. Travis Kendall, the defendant's father, talks about two phone calls on the ride home. And the gist of it is, it's clear that he wants to know two things. In the state's opinion, he wants to know, did anybody see your license plates? And did you leave anything behind? And if you believe that a father, take that back. I find it very hard to believe, and you're to weigh credibility, that a father who has just been told by his son, "I stabbed somebody," is worried about his fishing gear. Because that's what Travis Kendall says. When I asked if you left anything behind, it wasn't about making sure the cops can't find you. I'm worried about my or my son's fishing gear. Ladies and gentlemen, you weigh the credibility of witnesses. When I asked him about, did anybody see your license plate, I was concerned about retribution, not about hiding out from the cops. Maybe taking that statement in and of itself, maybe that's explainable, but you put those two statements together, and it's the state's opinion that this is just another example of behavior that was taking place in hiding out after that stabbing. Piece of the puzzle. Maverick Nelson. Maverick Nelson comes up and testifies very briefly that he talks to the defendant. The next day, he had heard about this fight, about this stabbing. His Dad had told him about it, and he calls the defendant up and says, hey, were you involved in this fight in St. Croix River? Defendant says, nope. Hangs up on him. And while that's a small piece of the puzzle, what does it say? You are the judges of credibility. So he lies. The defendant lies about his involvement in this matter. Another piece of the puzzle was a text that we heard from that Jacob Mossberg sent out. And then we heard about texts that came from the defendant. And he stated, or he sent this to Hank Michaels at 13:46 the day after the stabbing, 1:46 the day after the stabbing. And the defendant's text reads, quote, "'Cause if he died, dude, they would probably search the whole fucking woods." (1:46 the following day, the defendant is obviously concerned, at least believing, that Peter Kelly could have died. He's not been told that yet, but he certainly believes at that time that he could have died. He knows this is serious. He knows he didn't stab him in the arm. He knows he didn't stab him in the leg. He doesn't say that, but he knows that death is a possibility. Says that in his text. And his explanation for this statement about searching the whole woods was this would have been the beginning of a manhunt. It makes no sense. It certainly makes more sense in terms of that's where they dumped the drugs and threw the drugs into the woods. But again, it shows intent. It shows consciousness of guilt. It shows a lot about what was really happening in this matter. And then finally, in terms of the pieces of the puzzle that the state presented, you heard from Dan Clark. Dan Clark testified about his knowledge and relationship with Pete Kelly. I believe his statement was that Pete Kelly was one of the greatest people he had known. Talked about what kind of volunteer he was with the kids program, about with his high school wrestlers, about the kinds of things that he did during wrestling season to volunteer those length of days. Indicated that he hoped to one day be the type of father that Pete Kelly is. And you heard, finally, the last piece of the puzzle that the state presented was Christy Kelly. And you heard her very emotional testimony about her husband, father of her children, what kind of person he was, and what kind of man he was, and what kind of father he was. Because there's one major piece. There's pieces of this puzzle that are missing. But as I said, even when I'm putting together puzzles with my children, there can be pieces missing, but you can still clearly see the picture. You can still clearly see the picture here. Because when you're back there and deliberating, and you're going to read those instructions, there is the instructions on the burden of proof, beyond a reasonable doubt. That is a heavy burden to overcome. I acknowledge that. The state has a heavy burden to overcome. You're presumed innocent. I acknowledge that. But ladies and gentlemen of the jury, notice that that jury instruction does not say you are, the burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. It does not say beyond all doubt. Keep that in mind. You are to search for truth. You are not to search for doubt. And those are in your instructions when you take them back to deliberate. Because, folks, there's one major piece of this puzzle that you don't get to see. We didn't get to hear from Pete Kelly. That's why we called Dan Clark. That's why we called Christy Kelly, to put a voice, to put a face, to put some background on Pete Kelly. Because that's important. Because what we've heard from a lot of individuals, some pretty bad things about him. So it was important to note and to put a face on the deceased, on the victim in this matter. Now, just in terms, got to back up just a bit in terms of discussing some of the law here. Because we've got 3 charges. And first of all, a second-degree intentional homicide. And you can find him guilty of second-degree intentional homicide if the defendant caused the death of Peter Kelly. Well, we have no doubt in terms of that. We heard from Dr. Michael Madsen. We heard about the cause of death. I don't think there's any dispute here that the defendant caused the death of Peter Kelly. With the intent to kill. Intent to kill. Intent can be formed right up until the moment of the action. Intent can be seen from a person's actions, from a person's words, and from what the person does afterwards. Jake Mossberg and Hank Michaels say this shoulder lock, whatever this was, these 2 individuals were looking eye to eye. And I want you to consider a photograph that was presented by Dr. Madsen. I want you to, when you go back and deliberate, to take a look at Exhibit 26, which is this photograph that, not a photograph, actually a diagram that Dr. Madsen had drawn up, and how he testified that the knife wound was between the 5th and 6th rib in an upward trajectory. Hands on shoulders, knife wound up, eye to eye. This version, looking down at his belly button, reaching around, which we saw the defendant portray, doesn't even fit with the medical evidence that's been presented. It doesn't work. It doesn't fit. We saw that portrayed in opening statements. We saw the defendant walk around and do the exact same thing. It doesn't fit with what we heard from Dr. Michaels. The intent to kill can be looked at by looking at his actions after the stabbing as well. You heard about the texts. You heard about their actions of hiding. But we hammered over and over again about the lack of 911 calls and the lack of stopping for the police. And why do we do that? Why was I so incessant on asking those questions? Because I want you to think about one thing. In all of these discussions that you've heard with this defendant and his friends, with this defendant and his father, with this defendant when he took the stand, did you ever one time hear anybody refer to this as self-defense? We all know those terms. That's not a legal term. That's a term used regularly. This is self-defense. Did you hear anybody amongst their friends The three of them, from the defendant, from his father, in his conversations with his father. Anybody, did you hear the words self-defense? I don't believe he did. You can see a lot of what this defendant was thinking in his actions. He said he was so traumatized that he was just not there. I think he said outside of himself. But the testimony from Michaels and Phillips is that that night he goes home and gets in the Xbox and gets in a chat room. He's so distraught and so out of himself that he can't sleep that night. Says he can't sleep till the following morning when he goes to work. 8:30 the following morning, he posts the D's Nuts video on his Facebook. This funny video that they claim started this whole stabbing. That he's obviously worried about somebody dying. He texts that to Michaels later on. But at 8:30 the next morning, he posts this video. And what does he do with the video? And for those of you that may or may not be on Facebook, you can kind of alert people or you tag people that you want to make sure specifically get that video when they check onto Facebook. Who does he tag? Jake Mossberg, Hank Michaels, Stephen Phillips. Those three guys he tags on that video. My goodness, it's like he's dancing on Peter Kelly's grave. It's funny stuff to be posting that the morning after he stabbed somebody. It shows what his real state of mind was. Now, I ask that you look at that second-degree intentional homicide charge, and I ask that you weigh it carefully, and I ask you to look at his intent when he stabbed Peter Kelly. I ask that you find him guilty of that second-degree intentional homicide. If you choose, look at first-degree reckless homicide, that he caused the death of Peter Kelly. There can be no doubt. By criminally reckless conduct. Again, if you don't believe it was an intentional stabbing of him in the heart, if you choose not to believe that it was an intentional stabbing of Peter Kelly between the 5th and 6th rib, as he's looking at him eye to eye, is it criminally reckless conduct as he's looking eye to eye and stabs a man in the midsection? Does that conduct show utter disregard for human life? In the state's opinion, it absolutely does. Because even by the strange version of the defendant, if his head somehow is looking down at his shoes and sandals, he knows he doesn't stab him in the legs. He's apparently arm locked. He knows he doesn't stab him in the arms. He knows, even by this strange demonstration, which doesn't fit with the medical examiner, he knows he stabs him somewhere in the midsection. And that is utter disregard for human life. And if, again, somehow you don't find that to be an utter disregard for human life, I'd ask you to consider second-degree reckless homicide as well. And the only factor in that is cause the death. There's no doubt by criminally reckless conduct. And this was certainly criminal. It was certainly reckless. Now, we need to talk about the self-defense aspect of this case. Because we've been hearing, and we know that that's going to be an issue. We've been told that that's going to be an issue. And self-defense is allowable if the actor believed the force used was necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to himself. And that belief was reasonable. Imminent death. Not just death. Imminent death. You would have to believe that this defendant believed that death was imminent, that he was going to be killed by this individual imminently in order to buy that self-defense claim for that portion of the self-defense portion. He had not been struck by Peter Kelly at this point in time, had not been choked by Peter Kelly at this point in time, had not been kicked by Peter Kelly at this time. Even by his own admission, when the defendant took the stand, he said the entire physical confrontation, when he claimed he was pulled out of the car, he said could have taken as little as 5 seconds. Bam. It's approximately 5 seconds. You would have to believe that he was reasonable to believe in that period of time that Peter Kelly was going to kill him and that death was imminent, or that he was going to suffer great bodily harm. Great bodily harm. It's more than pain. It's more than stitches. It's more than a broken nose. It's more than a chipped tooth. It's more than a concussion. It's more than a temporary loss of consciousness. It's more than all of those things. So I want you, when you go back there and when you deliberate, you read that definition of great bodily harm. Read that definition and understand that great bodily harm is more than all of those things. You would have to believe that in that period of time, within that less than perhaps 5 seconds, that this defendant was reasonable in believing that he was going to suffer that type of injury or imminent death. That is not reasonable. You can't have that. You can't invite somebody over by saying, "See you then," or "I'll be here." Have them come over. And the interesting thing here is he gets in one altercation. He gets in a physical altercation with Ross Leckman, and he's pushed down or tossed aside, whatever. In an altercation with the bigger guy, ladies and gentlemen. Ross Leckman is the bigger guy at that point in time. And in this altercation with the bigger guy, what injury does he suffer? Scraped knees and a little blood blister on his hand. Doesn't require medical care, doesn't require anything. So he's known at that time, he's on notice at that point in time, that I get in an altercation with the bigger guy, I'm going to suffer some scrapes. And when he gets into a second altercation, perhaps, with Pete Kelly, or maybe not, maybe he just does this, but even in the worst case scenario, he gets into a second altercation with Pete Kelly. It is not reasonable to believe that he thought he was either going to imminently die or suffer great bodily harm. And that same argument, that same self-defense argument, that same lack of reasonableness applies to each and every count here. Because self-defense is an issue on each and every one of those counts. I'm not going to belabor this over and over again for those 3 counts. It's an issue on all 3 counts. And the same issue applies in all 3 of those counts. It's not reasonable. No chance. Beyond a reasonable doubt that a person, that he believed it, because you have to make the determination as to reasonableness. And imagine, if you can, a place where in that short a period of time, you can make up your mind to take another man's life. Because that's what he did. Took the life of Peter Kelly. And while he can get up here and sob and say he's sorry, who sobs for Peter Kelly? It's interesting, and again, I don't know if you will remember, but way back on voir dire of this matter, well, I want to go back just a second to when I talked about the reasonableness. And there's just been a lot of talk here amongst the defendant and his 3 friends about Pete Kelly being older and bigger. And you heard these guys stepped out of the darkness and they were bigger. I want you to keep in mind one couple of things. Testimony of Ross Lecklin, and he called himself Chubby. Pete used to call him his fluffy friend. I want you to take, when you go back, you'll have these exhibits, but I want you to keep in mind Exhibit 21. It's awful because it's a picture of a dead body, but he's cleaned up. Pete Kelly isn't some Superman, some ripped individual. You'll see there's not a lot of definition there. It's not this ginormous monster of a man that these 4 want to point him out, picture him out to be. He's 5'8", maybe a couple of inches taller than the defendant. And now I want you to compare those photographs to exhibits. You'll have these as well. Exhibits 90 and 89. A strong, very well-defined young man with the weights, who by his own boss's assertion is carrying 400-pound safes up 2 flights of stairs. He's got 3 other friends with him who will all jump in. We're all armed. We're all willing, ready, and able to jump in to protect him. All of those things go into seeing what this defendant was thinking at that time. It's just not reasonable. Going back to my final thoughts here. You may or may not remember way back in voir dire, one of the last questions that was talked about or asserted was Mr. Nelson asking that you not jump to conclusions. I don't know if any of you remember that or not, but he asked you to not jump to conclusions in this matter until you've heard all of the evidence. And I wrote that down way back then. I wrote down, don't jump to conclusions. Because a lot of this case is about jumping to conclusions. And the person who made the biggest jump to conclusion is the defendant. It was an absolutely unreasonable jump. He first of all jumped from being pushed down to pulling that knife. He made the jump, the ultimate jump, to use that knife and kill a man. This is a tragedy. This is a tragedy. This is an absolute nightmare for Western Wisconsin, for Polk County. And you know why it's not a nightmare? It's not a nightmare, as the defendant says, because this year has sucked. That's what he said towards the end of it. This has been awful because this year has sucked. This case is a tragedy because a man, a friend, a coach, a husband, and a father is gone forever. He's gone forever because, in the state's opinion, because of the intentional actions of this defendant. He indicated on the stand, did you intend to stab him? Yes, I intended to stab him. Yes, I did. And you can't take that thought out of your mind, the two demonstrations from his best friends, looking eye to eye at each other. Jake Mossberg even said, I'm looking eye to eye. They were looking eye to eye at each other. And as you're looking eye to eye and you got a knife in your hand and you stab him between the 5th and 6th ribs, that's intentional, that's an intent to kill. And his belief at that point, in terms of whether he was going to either be imminently killed or suffer great bodily harm, absolutely unreasonable. So I first asked you to find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. All the pieces of the puzzle are there. All the necessary pieces are there to see that clearly. And if you somehow can't find that, look to first-degree reckless homicide, because this was an act, a reckless act, an utter disregard of human life. Finally, if you can't find that, certainly this was an absolute reckless act that caused the death of Peter Kelly. Thank you.
We're going to take a break. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to leave your copies on your seats. Obviously, when you go back to the jury room, do not discuss this case. Your deliberations are not to begin, and we'll be back in 10 minutes. Please stand. Please be seated. Before Mr. Steffen began his closing, we had a sidebar. I think we need to make a record of that sidebar. Mr. Nelson.
Thank you. Your Honor, the final draft of the instructions was just handed to us moments before. The lesser included offense was added late last night, and after our conference in chambers, there were two things that were discussed that, as the court was reading them, I did notice. First is on page 6, I believe, of the instructions, where the court is instructing the jury about intent. The final paragraph reads, Levi Acre-Kendall did not reasonably believe that he was preventing or terminating an unlawful interference with his person, or did not reasonably believe that the force was used necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to himself. That really reads more as a factual statement. I believe that as we were editing and moving things around, that just got overlooked by all of the parties. I also noticed that as we discussed last night, there was a discussion of the definition of great bodily harm. The definition of great bodily harm should be included, as we discussed last night.
I agree.
So what we're going to do, there's no dispute of what Mr. Nelson said, and I concur. The second amended information was discussed last night. It wasn't provided till this morning, and those two errors, I believe, were made. The way we're going to remedy them is that during this break, I'm going to pick up their copies. I'm going to take out page 6. We're going to excise that offensive language that we all agree is an inaccurate statement of the law. And having listened to me read for 45 minutes, they're not going to be aware of the fact that the copies that they take back with them to the jury room are minus a sentence. As to great bodily harm and the definition that was agreed upon last evening, when they come back in and before Mr. Nelson argues, I'm going to tell them that I overlooked a particular instruction and I'm going to read it to them.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Any objection with that, Mr. Nelson?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Steffen?
I would just also note that in the first sentence on page 6, there is a technical typographic error. Evidence of motive does not be itself.
I actually read it correctly.
Yes,
I was, and we'll change that since we're making that change. Before we come back in, I just want to make certain that my version of the instruction on great bodily harm is the accurate one, the one that was agreed upon. So counsel stopped by my office before we reconvene. Please stand. Yeah, we're going to take the break, then meet me in my office. I hope 10 minutes. Becky, could you help me get these?
Oh, yeah. I heard a voice. Didn't know from where. You want me to leave? Can I leave the verdicts here?
Yeah, leave the verdicts there.
This one's not. It's not mine.